The more Thomas Andre repeated death, the stronger he became, little by little. Even without leveling up conventionally, all his combat experience accumulated. All of Liege's attack patterns and weaknesses were etched into Thomas Andre's muscles and brain. The same applied to his soul. As his experiences visiting the Sea of the Afterlife continued to accumulate, his vessel grew increasingly stronger and more resilient. It was a never-ending cycle. Let's fight again, Legia. It repeated again, and again. Legia. Continuously, you have died. Would you like to restart? Again. Eventually, Legia's patience ran out. He snapped. Crack. Do you still not understand? No matter how many times you repeat this, there is no chance for you to win. So, you won't fight? What kind of creature is this? The King of Giants was furious, indomitable fighting spirit. He simply couldn't comprehend Thomas Andre's appearance, returning shamelessly as if nothing had happened after dying countless times, burning with fighting spirit. And at the subsequent, blatant provocation, sparks flew from Legia's eyes. Ah, perhaps your giant race can only flee and avoid fights when there's no chance of winning? This provocation was destined to land, because there was absolutely no trace of bluff in Thomas Andre's appearance as he casually adjusted his sunglasses, lips curled upwards. Under the pledge of sincerity, every word coming from this insignificant little human's mouth was entirely genuine, and he had declared his intentions towards him, filled with sincerity, time and time again. King of Giants, Legia. That blatant gaze, you will surely die here by my hand. It was utterly absurd. The look in that man's eyes held the genuine intent to kill him. He regarded him, the great King of Giants, as mere prey. I am humanity's strongest hunter, and you are the largest and strongest prey I have ever seen. How dare you? Oblivious to how reckless and impossible it was. As the attempts repeated, that sincerity was clearly and firmly being imprinted upon Legia. By the pledge of sincerity binding them. All those words were filled to the brim with sincere killing intent. So remember it clearly even in death. My name is Thomas Andre, not Sung Jinwoo too. I am humanity's strongest hunter, who will kill you. Perhaps killing this man without releasing the chains that bound him would be an easier path to take. If he himself had only one life, he certainly would have done so. No, perhaps that was the original storyline. A special event where this enormous chunk of experience points was served up before him, hands and feet bound tightly, to allow the player easy and rapid growth. If not for that, there would be no reason to present such a strong boss monster. Impossible to face at the current level, bound hand and foot right before his eyes. But what fun would it be to just follow the predetermined story, especially when he had spare lives? Facing a difficult game, what was the problem with repeating the events until success was achieved? As long as the goal was worth reaching. Wasn't repeating it hundreds, thousands of times possible precisely because it was a game? Thomas Andre charged at the King of Giants once more. Legia roared, "Why go to such lengths? Do you not fear death? Do you not tire of repeating the agony? Tire? How could I possibly abandon this place, leaving behind something as large and beautiful as you? What? Anything that makes my heart race is beautiful. You are no exception. I'm trapped with a complete madman." Legia thus defined the human named Thomas Andre, and truly, ironically, quite cruelly, the horrific nightmares Thomas had repeatedly dreamt every night for years past. The excruciating nightmares of being thoroughly and mercilessly defeated by the violence of Sung Jinwoo, a being far more overwhelmingly powerful than the likes of Legia before him. At this moment, facing the formidable enemy, they were serving as his unshakable encouragement, repeating a battle destined for defeat, yet never stopping, repeating the quests in front of him each day. Was that a game? No, to Thomas that was life itself. I learned something new thanks to this game. Fighting the weak is mere violence, but fighting the strong is courage, and Sung Jinwoo's life experienced within this game. It's not because I'm a special human. He too, Sung Jinwoo, always lived like this, born infinitely weak, yet always preparing for death, charging at the strong, an underdog. Looking back, his own childhood was similarly difficult. White trash. Growing up in a poor white immigrant family in America, bullied in a school full of black children. To survive in those lawless slums, he had to become strong himself. The weak lose everything. The strong take it all. In that respect, Thomas Andre was quite lucky. He was born with a stronger body than others. If someone hit him, he was the type of innate tough guy who would immediately charge back and bite off an ear. But Sung Jinwoo's life was different from the start. Humanity's weakest weapon? An E-rank hunter? Born into all that inferiority, a life lived as a social underdog. To fight, risking one's life to protect family within that context, truly required courage. And now his son is doing the same, saying he'll help his father who went off on a business trip far away. Sung Suho, the son of the shadow monarch, Sung Jinwoo. Thinking of the kid's face who must be somewhere, striving to improve even at this moment, Thomas Andre gritted his teeth. That's why I absolutely cannot give up. Even that snot-nosed kid is running around trying to save the world alone like his father, so being an adult and just watching is frankly embarrassing. Relying on just one person for the entire future and just watching is a foolish act I refuse to repeat. Because Thomas Andre had already experienced that desperate future once, because he knew the overwhelming fear felt before the numerous monarchs, he absolutely could not give up this time. He refused to give up. And the result, Sung Jinwoo, now I finally understand why you were so strong. Thomas suddenly murmured. You were always fighting enemies like this. Only now have I finally approached your level. Before he knew it, the king of giants lay before him, gasping for breath. Now it was time for the finish. Thomas Andre drew his serrated sword to slice through the creature's tough hide and sever its neck. He had finally won. You worked hard. Now die. But then, Legia, lying exhausted, suddenly burst into hearty laughter, his back shaking. However, the feeling was completely different from before, as if he had become someone else entirely. Flash! Suddenly, a light flashed, enveloping the entire dungeon. And from Legia's collapsed body, a magical beast resembling a crocodile emerged. Magnificent, a worthy vessel has finally appeared. You are? A strange light appeared in Thomas Andre's eyes. Kindly, this game displayed names above enemies' heads. King of monstrous humanoids, monarch of trials. Confirming it, Thomas adopted a guarded stance. A moot? A new monarch? Kirk, do not be alarmed. I am something like an administrator of this game. Administrator? I don't know what business an administrator has, but this is an important moment, so don't interfere. It's finally time for me to kill this guy and level up. Ah, that's why I came personally. This is actually something like a hidden quest, so I have to hand over the reward myself. This was a hidden quest, so to speak. You were the first and will likely be the last. No one else will attempt such a mad act as you did. Who? At the words first and last, a strange light flickered in Thomas Andre's eyes. He didn't know the reason, but wasn't it quite a rewarding statement for the first player of this game? Anyway, take your reward. Amit grinned wickedly and opened his palm. Whoosh! Then, a sphere of swirling darkness appeared above his palm. Is that the reward? Yes. It is called the Primordial Darkness, a fresh one I recently acquired. But the race that originally inherited this power became extinct long ago, and there was no one else qualified, making it difficult to make use of it. But to think a vessel capable of proving their qualification for this power would appear among humans. Smiling contentedly, the sphere of darkness from Amit's hand slowly flew towards Thomas Andre. He instinctively accepted it. That darkness is now yours. You are sufficiently qualified. At that moment, the primordial darkness permeated Thomas Andre. The qualification was sufficient, and the vessel was not lacking. It was the moment a new king of giants was born. From the start, this Tower of Trials, this level-up system incorporated into the tower, was a place designed to give trials until a human vessel could contain the power of a monarch. Back to the present. Thomas Andre, who had succeeded in becoming the king of giants after much hardship, was playing the game when he sensed the anomaly and emerged from the capsule. Boom! Crack! Kayak! Thomas Andre was tearing off and breaking the giant butterfly's wings and legs one by one with overwhelming physical force. With each shattered joint, each torn wing, golden blood scattered into the sky from the wounds. How can a human harbor the primordial darkness? Our plan was perfect. For a mere human to become the king of giants. Never done weightlifting? If you keep tearing and recovering, you get bigger. Seems the soul's vessel is similar. Thomas's giant palm covered the sky, blocking the view. Before it, the apostle of conquest trembled in fear. Kaha! The first hunt of a new monarch. Quite a spectacle. Amut's laughter was heard from somewhere. This will be your first step towards conquest. Continue, King of Giants. At that voice, Thomas Andre grinned faintly and delivered the finishing blow. Crack! At that moment, gold and black light explosively collided. The creature's body released tremendous energy, and as the largest one died, the smaller apostles of conquest scattered throughout New York City instantly turned to dust and dispersed. King of Giants, Monarch of Conquest. His new title was confirmed at that moment, and at that time, in the White House, the president and his advisors were watching the entire scene unfold. Thomas Andre has defeated the monster, an advisor said with a trembling voice. No, he has become a new monster. Silence fell in the White House meeting room, and a phrase simultaneously surfaced in all their minds. National-level hunter. That title, which until recently existed only within the game released by Agensoft, was officially formalized by unanimous consent at that moment, because a monster like that, capable of overthrowing a nation if he wished, could hardly be classified merely as S-rank. So, Amut, Thomas Andre asked in the direction where he felt Amut's presence. What is Suho doing now? Has he become a monarch like me? Not yet. The issue of the vessel hasn't been resolved yet. Vessel? If he's his son, it shouldn't be lacking? Quite the opposite was sufficient from the start, more than sufficient, even overflowing. But sometimes, what you put inside the vessel is more important than its size. With those words, Amut chuckled and disappeared. Thomas Andre, looking at the empty space, smiled in a similar manner. What you put inside, indeed, that must be it. It was a smile that only those who had inherited the primordial darkness could comprehend. Ting, the King of Giants, Monarch of Conquest is born. System, record this as my deed as well. It seems I've just completed another vessel. Suho grinned, speaking to the system that was calculating his class change. Then, as if in response to his words, numerous level-up notifications appeared one after another. Ting, 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 level up, level up. A feast of immense experience points flooded in as if waiting. Suho's level soared sky high. There wasn't any particular quest, nor had Suho directly defeated a magical beast. Yet, as if he had extorted them by threatening the system, the experience points came in response to his words. But this was neither a threat nor conversation. As Suho had stated, he was simply being rewarded with the correct amount of advancement points corresponding to his achievements. Furthermore, Suho no longer considered these levels or experience figures important. From the start, these numbers were merely indicators of how the system defined his existence. But, to be more precise, the system wasn't the judge of that either. It was literally an auxiliary device, a convenient calculator that easily deciphered how much Suho's rank had risen. Then, what was the true entity that actually judged Suho's rank? Suho had been gradually realizing the answer for a long time. It started as a vague guess, but only after becoming strong enough to clear even the class change quest did he finally become certain. At this very moment, a gaze was reaching him, meticulously examining the path Suho had walked, not through numerical calculations, but far more directly and fundamentally, seeking to define his name. Suho met that appraising gaze squarely and grinned. I always wondered, what exactly is that unknown skill? Skill, unknown. The unidentified skill that had always forcibly stopped time in various situations and dragged his soul somewhere. Thanks to that skill, Suho had experienced truly diverse events. He had inadvertently become a priest for dead monarchs. He had also helped with the succession ceremonies for new monarchs. There was one common thread in all those events: nothingness. The pure white world that always existed at the final destination Suho reached through that skill. An endlessly unfolding white horizon, where nothing existed except him, the boundary of nothingness. An unknown space where even the dead monarchs who had thoroughly returned to nothingness without leaving even a soul could briefly open their eyes. Suho could now properly ascertain the identity of that place, because at this very moment, as that blatant gaze from beyond assessed Suho's rank, he could simultaneously look properly beyond that gaze. So he looked up at the incredibly vast existence beyond and curled his lips. I see now. The world tree has a shadow too. Whoosh! As soon as those words ended, a pure white shadow enveloped Suho. Ting. Activated. Whoosh! As always, the area of the class change quest surrounding Suho melted away, and a pure white darkness completely covered it. And as always, an endless horizon stretched out before him. But whereas until now, dead monarchs had always awaited Suho beyond that horizon, today was different. The existence waiting for Suho beyond was not some monarch, but something he had anticipated. The world tree stood tall, looking down at Suho from an incredible height. Now it's certain. Though he had encountered the world tree several times already, this time it looked different. This place, now, was the opposite side. This white shadow, filling his entire vision, was the vast shadow cast behind the world tree, the shade of the world tree. And beyond the pure white horizon, someone offered a simple greeting. Simultaneously, the white shadow shimmered, and an existence mimicking Suho's form approached. Meeting its gaze, he also greeted it. Yes, hello to you too. Should I say we've met before? We have. I was always by your side. What should I call you? World tree? At Suho's question, he calmly shook his head. No, the world tree is dead. It slowly withered and died after the creator perished. Then what are you? I am the shadow of the world tree, the great flow of souls left behind when the world tree died. Simultaneously with that answer, a change occurred in the passive skill section of the skill information window that automatically opened. Ting. Passive skill, a max, ting. Passive skill, shadow of the world tree. Finally, the name of the previously unidentified skill was revealed. Checking the status window, Suho asked, Shadow of the world tree, do plants have souls? Usually not, but the world tree is no ordinary plant. The shadow of the world tree, with the same face as Suho, answered while looking back at him. The world tree is the origin of this universe, a cyclical device that returns dead souls to living beings. If forced to categorize, it is a tool of the creator, like the cup of reincarnation. And I now am the shadow cast beneath the death of that tool and its soul. World tree. Recently, even the Apostle of Conquest fighting Suho had been overjoyed upon sensing the world tree's energy nearby. That's how essential and inevitable the world tree's existence was, exerting immense influence on the universe just by being there. It was a massive lump of nutrients, harboring tremendous energy in itself. Even with the world tree now dead, that fact remained unchanged. There was a time when the soldiers of the rulers were born from the fruits of the world tree, but it has long since lost that function. And as time goes on, the world tree will wither even more than now and lose more functions. When that happens, what do you think will occur in this universe? The shadow of the world tree asked calmly. But it wasn't a question seeking an answer. Not just the soldiers of the rulers, but no other life forms will be born either. Including humans, it will become a world where no new children are born, and existing life forms only gradually age and die. At that definitive statement, Suho's eyes widened. No one will be born anymore? Correct. And the signs have already begun. The universe is increasingly transforming into one where deaths overwhelmingly outnumber births. Truly, the end of the universe. A universe without a god ultimately ends this way. But it's all right. You have a choice. A choice? Yes, your father. The shadow of the world tree gestured towards Suho and said, Your father, the shadow monarch, can raise all the souls of this universe into the legion of death. Then this will truly become a dimension of death. No new births, but death is eternal. That too is a new beginning and an end. Objectively speaking, it's not a bad outcome. Much better than being devoured by the gods of the outer universe. I don't think my father would want that. As Suho's expression hardened, the shadow of the world tree readily nodded. True, he likely wouldn't. I know your father's disposition well. While being the king who rules death, he simultaneously loves life more than anyone. Such irony is also a characteristic of the human race. Therefore, the world tree concluded that in the end, there is only one remaining method. The shadow of the world tree smiled palely, pointing at itself. Specifically, using me, using the shadow of the world tree to somehow revive the world tree itself. Using the shadow to revive it, does that mean using the shadow power on you? No. If it could be resolved that easily, I would have asked your father long ago. The shadow of the world tree wore a bitter expression. First, let me explain properly about the world tree. Whoosh! This will be easier than listening. With those words, new knowledge flowed into Suho's mind. That knowledge concerned the flow of all souls circulating around the world tree. Since it was a passage through which all souls moved, the massive tree itself was akin to a vast spiritual universe. Biko, sea of that, its fundamental nature was the exact opposite of the sea of the afterlife. If the sea of the afterlife was a spiritual universe existing as a deep abyss of darkness, the bottom of the abyss, the shadow of the world tree towering above it, was the opposite. It was a spiritual universe composed not of the legion of death raised by the shadow power, but of the vast souls seeking to be reborn as new life forms. In short, the shadow of the world tree is a natural spiritual universe that does not defy death. Not a single soul, but a great flow and passage for souls. Because of that, the white shadow of the world tree, extending beyond the deep shade of darkness, reached out towards the entire universe. However, that shadow was simply too vast to be contained within one's sight. But precisely because of that characteristic, the shadow of the world tree possesses a nature utterly unreachable by the shadow monarch who exists as the king who rules death. The passage for souls seeking not to defy death is like oil and water, a relationship where they cannot mix. Ultimately, it meant that even the shadow monarch could not raise the shadow of the world tree. But the instinct of the world tree, originally created to sustain the universe, desperately extended its shadow for the sake of this universe, even as it withered and died, hoping its edge would somehow reach someone qualified, and that hope finally barely succeeded in reaching somewhere. That was you, Sung Suho. The shadow of the world tree pointed at Suho again and spoke. The son of the shadow monarch, a new life born from the king of death. You, born bearing both life and death, those exact opposite attributes, perhaps you could create a special variable. That was the best the world tree could conceive at the final moment. But that was merely creating a variable, not a perfect solution. Even the world tree could not dare judge what kind of variable the existence known as Sung Suho would create. So, for the time being, like watering and nurturing a sprout, the decision was made to first foster your growth. Though no one could guarantee what fruit would bear at the end of that growth, it was the best option at the time. Even actively utilizing the system applied to you, if necessary. Ho! Finally, Suho, having absorbed all the knowledge conveyed by the shadow of the world tree as his own, calmly opened his eyes. Deep within those pupils, tranquil darkness and light intermingled. In that calmness, Suho looked back on his past days, a young age that could never be called a long life. But so many things had happened in between, a life that had passed through many experiences and trials. Using all those as nourishment, he had become who he was now. And exactly reflecting this current self like a mirror, he looked at the white shadow standing before him with a calm gaze and asked, "So, what's the result? Are you satisfied with me now? Perhaps? That is rather the question I wish to ask you. I have merely watched over your growth. From now on, the choice rests solely with you. So I ask, what fruit do you wish to bear now? Setting aside the continuation of the universe and the revival of the world tree, what kind of existence do you yourself wish to become? You say not to worry about the continuation of the universe and the revival of the world tree? Is that all right? Yes, as I first said, I am merely the shadow of the world tree. The continuation and circulation of the universe is the duty of the world tree. It has nothing to do with me, the shadow. Therefore, as I first stated, I see the ending where everyone becomes soldiers of death and lives eternally as not bad either. Wouldn't it be fine for at least one such dimension to exist among the many universes? The shadow of the world tree faced Suho with a somewhat mischievous smile. That expression was exactly like the one Suho made when he was being playful. Therefore, I am simply curious about your intentions. But though his mouth was smiling, his eyes had been staring intently into Suho's soul from the very beginning, with an unwavering, straightforward gaze, because you are everything to me. I am everything? Suho asked again at the words that held a strange resonance. Then, the shadow of the world tree nodded and introduced itself in a way different from before. I am the shadow of the world tree, and an existence born solely to reach you. Smiling. In other words, I am the irregular, white shadow, born only for you. Therefore, I have long awaited the moment when I would finally meet you. Although the shadow of the world tree defined itself as such, that name was simultaneously the most fitting expression to symbolize Sung Suho, standing face to face with it here. You are the son of the Shadow Monarch, and at the same time, an existence with the ruler's authority dwelling within your soul from the moment of birth. You probably cannot fathom how significant that is, because you have been such an existence since the moment you were born. That is why I intend to tell you. Fa! With those words, new knowledge flowed into Suho. Before that, let me ask just one thing. How much do you truly know about your father? Shadow Monarch. That knowledge was none other than the story of his own father, Sung Jinwoo. Most children, transcending race and dimension, do not know in detail what kind of life the parents who gave birth to them have lived. They don't even wonder in the first place, nor do they ask. Because parents existed from the moment they were born, it's as natural as breathing, so they are not even aware of what they don't know. But you, at least, must know. About your father. The shadow of the world tree spoke with a faint smile. Sung Jinwoo, though your father is now called by the name Shadow Monarch, his origins lie in a completely different place. Precisely, the primordial light. The memory of creation unfolded before Suho's eyes. This is a story you already know. The creator of this universe, now deceased, split the primordial light to create the fragments of brilliant light, namely the rulers. Likewise, he split the primordial darkness to create the 8 monarchs, and to the fragments of brilliant light he gave the mission to protect this world. Simultaneously, to the monarchs, he gave the mission to destroy this world, and he made the two forces fight endlessly. As he said, this was a story Suho knew well, and he also knew the outcome. Catastrophe. The fragments of brilliant light, enraged upon learning that all the war was solely for the absolute being's amusement, staged a rebellion and murdered their god. But the story the shadow of the world tree intended to tell began after that. However, there was one being who did not join that rebellion, the greatest fragment of brilliant light, the primordial light that served the absolute being more faithfully than anyone else. That was Ashbourne, the first shadow monarch. The absolute being, wary of the fragments of brilliant light and monarchs who had grown enough to potentially threaten him through the eons-long war, had made one provision. He had implanted within Ashbourne, his most loyal servant, the power to return everything to nothingness. It was a power that should never have awakened, should never have existed. The moment the absolute being met his death at the hands of his creation's rebellion, the 9th monarch, who should not exist, embodying both the primordial light and the primordial darkness simultaneously, was born. Tracing back, the first irregular wasn't Sung Suho, but the shadow monarch himself. Because he was an existence embodying the powers of polar opposites, which could not and should not exist together within one body. Though each was merely a fragment, the fact that those fragments possessing opposing powers merged into one was by no means an ordinary event. The primordial light split into 8 pieces. The primordial darkness split into 8 pieces. 2 attributes that could never become one have merged. The shadow of the world tree dared to say something that no one else could think of. That meant the being itself became a fragment of Itarim. A fragment of Itarim. At the unexpected words, Suho's eyes widened significantly. In contrast, the shadow of the world tree maintained a consistently calm tone, despite the shocking content. It was merely relaying a story everyone knew, but delving a little deeper. Yes, embodying both the primordial light and darkness simultaneously means just that. The powerful foundation of Fo, RCE, which the creator had deliberately split in half, merged again. Of course, even so, it was merely a fragment. But at the moment the true god died, it became the one and only existence qualified to replace him in that position. And that was precisely the reason why all monarchs and rulers revered Ashbourne. In short, the moment the fragment of light and the fragment of darkness merged, Ashbourne became an absolute existence that could overwhelm everyone else by his presence alone. However, this was by no means the outcome the absolute being desired. It was merely a preparation for a what-if that should never have happened. From the absolute being's perspective, It was a provision made while sincerely believing such an unimaginable thing as rebellion would never occur. In the case where his creations simultaneously turned against him, he prepared a weapon capable of crushing them all. Though that weapon did not contain all the powers of a god, in terms of simple combat ability, it was truly the strongest. A weapon powerful enough to fend off all his created beings, even if they attacked simultaneously. The proof was right before them. Even though numerous Itarim from beyond the outer universe were invading, aiming for this realm, the Shadow Monarch was effortlessly holding them back. In the first place, such a feat is absolutely impossible with the power of a mere monarch. Are you saying, that's only possible because my father is a fragment of Itarim? Correct. To be precise, it's because he inherited the fragment of Itarim. Let me reiterate, the one who became the fragment of Itarim was Ashborn, not Sung Jinwoo. In fact, that part is the most miraculous and surprising aspect, that a human's vessel could be vast enough to contain a fragment of Itarim. The shadow of the world tree stroked its chin with an expression of genuine curiosity, but from its perspective, there was no way to satisfy this curiosity. As mentioned before, the world tree and the shadow monarch were like oil and water. The king who defied death and the world tree which did not were existences that could never meet. Hence, the conclusion it arrived at was, Sung Suho. I could reach you, born as Sung Jinwoo's son. It was truly fortunate. Sung Suho was a different breed altogether from Sung Jinwoo, not a fragment of Itarim, but a new life form born from a fragment of Itarim. If Sung Jinwoo was an existence where the primordial light and darkness merged into one, Sung Suho was born with primordial darkness and light already combined. Thanks to that, Suho could instinctively use the ruler's authority, the power of light, from a young age, and simultaneously he could freely traverse between the world of life and the world of death. The results were similar, but the principle of their birth was fundamentally different. Do you know? While giving birth to you, how much holy water of life potions do you think Chahayan consumed? What? At those words, Suho's expression instantly hardened. Simultaneously, the image of his mother, Chahayan, appeared before him as an illusion created by the shadow of the world tree. It was a scene it remembered well. Chahayan. Her belly was swollen like a large mountain, indicating it was before Suho's birth. Like all expectant mothers, she was feeling labor pains while carrying her son in her womb. But just as her son was a special existence, those labor pains were also extraordinary. Chahayan faced death several times before giving birth to you, and each time, Sung Jinwoo fed her the holy water of life. Thanks to that, Chahayan barely survived the brink of death and safely gave birth to her baby. Thus, Suho was born. Looking back, it was a truly critical moment. Think about it. From the perspective of the Shadow Monarch harboring a fragment of Itarim, if you hadn't been born safely, or if his beloved partner had died in the process, what would he have felt? What decision might he have made? The shadow of the world tree asked in a light tone, but the way-t of the question was by no means light. And the answer to that, somehow, Suho felt like he had already heard it earlier. If Mother died, in fact, from Suho's perspective, it was a hypothesis he had imagined several times long ago, considering the worst-case scenario, the past few years, the overwhelming fear of both his parents suddenly going missing. There were years lived amidst the worry and sorrow that perhaps it wasn't a disappearance. And now, at this point where he had learned and was using the shadow power, the moment Suho thought of his mother's death, only one alternative came to mind. If that had happened, would he have revived Mother as a shadow soldier? Suho's choked voice quietly escaped his lips. The shadow of the world tree nodded. That's right, with a very high probability. Wouldn't such an option definitely exist? Of course, knowing your father's personality, he would have respected Chahayan's wishes. But even then, you must first summon the dead soul to ask for its wishes, right? Then, since he summoned her anyway, wouldn't it be okay to live together for just a few decades before returning her to nothingness? A few centuries would be even better. Suho fell silent. At his reaction, the shadow of the world tree shrugged and continued speaking. But would it only be Chahayan? What about your grandfather and grandmother? They are old, won't they die of old age soon? In the end, all humans eventually die. whether by illness, old age, or being torn apart by a magical beast. But isn't it a bit unfair? And the words that followed were somewhat realistic, chillingly so. The truth is, other people also have families they love, but when the families of others die, they are just left to grieve, while the Shadow Monarch alone lives happily ever after with his entire family, eternally immortal. Isn't that a bit unfair? Even though he has the ability to revive all those people, deliberately letting them die seems quite cruel, doesn't it? It was a considerably difficult problem. Even Suho himself felt complex emotions, unsure what choice he would make if placed in such a position, and simultaneously, he wondered, what would father have done? His father must have experienced such situations several times already. If so, how many times had he watched acquaintances die before his eyes? Imagining his father raising all of them as shadow soldiers somehow didn't seem fitting. No wonder father didn't seem to have many friends. The conclusion was a bit anticlimactic, but it was true. Recalling his father's appearance as he had observed him throughout his life, he seemed outgoing, yet surprisingly, he rarely formed close bonds with others. A very small number of friends besides family. He recalled images of him thoroughly drawing lines with everyone else. Perhaps that was his own mindset, a determination not to get deeply involved in the deaths of acquaintances. And recalling that image of his father, Suho felt a little bitter. But the Shadow of the World Tree, having witnessed the moment Suho was born, understood the practical worries and decisions the Shadow Monarch faced at that moment better than Suho did. If your father were to raise all beings in this world as shadow soldiers so they could be together forever, what kind of universe would that truly be? Suho felt like he had already heard the answer to that earlier. So that's what you meant before. The dimension of death, a future where everyone lives on as shadow soldiers. Correct. When you were born, your mother was fortunately safe, but being human, she will eventually face death someday. What choice will your father make then? And once he has revived someone close to him, wouldn't it become easier to revive others? Listening to the story of the Shadow of the World Tree, which presented a plausible future, Suho was lost in thought. Then he raised his head and asked, "So what are you trying to say? Why are you telling me this story?" I asked first, "What do you want to do? Your intention. You seem to have forgotten, but we were discussing your class change quest, weren't we?" Ting, as if waiting, the system message returned before Suho's eyes. An opportunity to advance to a higher class based on acquired advancement points is given. Beginning calculation. Calculating advancement points. Advancement points. No longer did Suho see these as mere numbers. It was the future ahead, the path he would walk. Will you become the Monarch of Destruction as planned? That's not a bad choice either. You would acquire a great power to help your father. The Shadow of the World Tree urged for an answer. Suho looked directly at it and opened his mouth. Circa and Amut conversed while watching Nidhugg. It's taking longer than expected. Have patience. You took much longer than this. This was the Sea of the Afterlife, where a harsh winter had arrived. Due to the blizzard, pure white snow now covered the top of the World Tree. Truly, the World Tree's nightmare. Even Nidhugg, who had fled to the higher branches, could not remain unharmed in this cold. Nidhugg, the serpent that gnaws at the roots of the World Tree. Currently, Nidhugg was completely sealed by Circa's power, frozen solid by the harsh blizzard she unleashed. Just like Circa herself had been trapped within a massive ice wall during her succession ceremony. Grr, what's with that glare? What can you possibly do? Circa felt a strange sensation anew. Nidhugg, stiffly frozen on the snow-covered branches of the World Tree, didn't exude the same pressure as when she first saw it. Well, it was only natural. When she first saw Nidhugg, the creature harbored an energy so immense it made her mind go blank. It wasn't just a matter of size. Due to the primordial darknesses it contained, it radiated a pressure comparable to a cosmic catastrophe. Against such a being, the will or courage to fight directly was meaningless. One could only undergo the trial it presented and be judged for qualification. Failing meant becoming mere prey, waiting for inevitable execution. But not anymore. Nidhugg was no longer the same entity as back then. Now it only had 3 heads remaining. The other 4 had already been absorbed by their side. Counting purely by numbers, we have more. king of demons, monarch of gluttony, Esil, king of snowfolk, monarch of nightmares, Circa, king of monstrous humanoids, monarch of trials, Amit, and king of giants, monarch of conquest, Thomas Andre. Of course, since each primordial darkness possessed different properties and strengths, it couldn't be simply measured by numbers alone. The capabilities and specific authorities of the monarchs also varied greatly. However, regardless of how many remained, to the monarchs who had proudly inherited the primordial darkness, Nidhogg was no longer the object of vague fear it once was. They had already proven their qualifications. Nidhogg was no longer the judge evaluating their vessels. Surprisingly, to them now, the entity known as Nidhogg was merely a warehouse still storing 3 primordial darknesses. Immediately after Amut became the monarch of trials and used his authority to spread the Tower of Trials across the world, Suho led all his allies in pursuit of the fleeing Nidhogg. The purpose was none other than his own succession. Despite having undergone the Dragon King's trials several times, Suho had still not become the monarch of destruction. Setting aside the reason for that, the immediate goal was to hunt Nidhogg and secure the primordial darkness first. He was a hunter, after all. A hunter. Nidhogg hid amongst the vast world tree, whose end could not be fathomed, but finding it wasn't much of a problem. As immense as the world tree was, Nidhogg's size was also considerable. Furthermore, Arsha deployed her void insects throughout the world tree area, thoroughly searching potential hiding spots. The result found it. Gruar! Nidhogg, curled up between the branches to escape the harsh cold, immediately charged fiercely upon encountering Suho. But there was no fear. Amut is on our side. Boom! Amut's fist, immediately lunging forward, struck Nidhogg squarely. Amut already had a record of grabbing Nidhogg's maw with his bare hands and tearing it apart. Of course, the wound from that time had long since vanished without even a scar. Nidhogg, living by consuming the abundant leaves of the world tree nearby, recovered quickly from any injury. But so what? We just need to catch it and tear it apart again. Grrr! Amut's overwhelming violence and Nidhogg's furious struggles clashed at the heart of the world tree. The aftermath was tremendous, but the outcome of the fight was decided from the start. Amut, already strong, had become even more powerful after inheriting the primordial darkness. If Nidhogg hadn't been a being capable of continuous regeneration and recovery, Amut alone might have been able to hunt it. Of course, even among monarch-level beings, not everyone was as strong as Amut. While there were others that focused on combat like him, there were also those like Circa, whose strength lay in nightmare-like debuffs. And Suho utilized their talents appropriately to hunt Nidhogg. Circa, now! Freeze it! Wah! At Suho's command, an intense cold engulfed Nidhogg. Cruel. Then, the massive head, battling Amut, momentarily froze solid, and the twin daggers held in Suho's hands emitted intense light towards the neck of the creature covered in white frost. Item Kamish's Wrath. Type Dag Power. The finest dagger crafted by a master artisan from the sharpest fang among dragon teeth. Its sharpness is unparalleled, and its sensitivity to mana is exceptional. This allows it to become an even more powerful weapon depending on the user's capability. Though the blades were significantly dulled from countless battles, they have been perfectly restored thanks to the efforts of outstanding master craftsmen. Until now, the Shadow Dwarves had worked tirelessly day and night to repair the damaged Kamish's Wrath. This was possible because Cha-Hae-In had procured the necessary materials from the tomb of the Berserk Dragons. The result, Kamish's Wrath, having perfectly regained its former sharpness, surged forward, saturated with the breath of destruction unleashed by Suho. Slice. The scorching energy of destruction severed Nidhogg's frozen neck. Qua-boom! The severed head of Nidhogg exploded, scattering pitch-black darkness in all directions. But the primordial darkness that emerged had no master. Fwah! Kirk! Instantly, the eyes of Amut, closest to the darkness, twitched. The darkness returns. Just when they had succeeded in cutting off one head, surprisingly, the masterless primordial darkness began to return to it. Nidhogg hadn't done anything specific, as though by instinct the darkness was absorbed, as if sucked into it. Then, astonishingly, a new serpent head began to sprout from that spot. Grrr! Witnessing that scene, Suho made an instantaneous judgment. In such cases, it was one of two things. Either that darkness wasn't Antares' darkness, or he still lacked the qualification. For now, he decided not to dwell on the latter. Focusing on the former possibility, he cut off another of Nidhugg's heads using the same method. The first time was difficult, the next was easy. Freeze and cut. That was all. If other heads interfered in the process, Amut and the other monarchs would each block them. The numbers were equal anyway. Thus, new darkness burst forth again, and futilely it returned not to Suho, but back to Nidhugg. No matter how many times he cut, the result was the same. Suho tasted bitterness in his mouth. It came to this, he finally had to admit it. The fact that he still lacked the qualification. Even if he now possessed the strength to hunt Nidhugg any time, absorbing the primordial darkness was an entirely different matter. Amut approached Suho and asked, "What will you do now? There are no more heads left to try. Only that one remains, and Gray is already inside undergoing the succession." Even while the war raged outside, Gray still showed no sign of emerging from within. It seemed the succession ceremony was proceeding in a lengthy manner, much like Circa's had. At Amut's words, Suho's gaze lingered for a moment on the Nidhugg's head Gray had entered. Within that head, which had remained tightly shut throughout the battle, lay the darkness of the King of Beasts, the Fang Monarch. There was no need to force it open. What he desired was Antares' power. Ultimately, it was a failure. The strategy to ignore the succession ceremony and directly hunt Nidhegg Te obtain the primordial darkness. However, it wasn't entirely without gain. Thanks to repeatedly encountering the primordial darkness like this, he had learned how to handle masterless primordial darkness. Circa. Suho called Circa and gave an order. Pointing at the scene where the primordial darkness that had just burst out was returning to Nidhugg again. "Can you perhaps freeze that darkness?" At those words, Circa was greatly startled. Even Esil was taken aback. Esil, the monarch of gluttony who desired to eat almost anything, instinctively realized the moment she encountered primordial darkness that wasn't hers. Eating it means death. Survival instinct. This was an instinct only monarchs who had inherited darkness could understand. Harboring two or more primordial darknesses is impossible. One without qualification eating it is also impossible. Even if forcibly frozen and swallowed, the primordial darkness would shatter the vessel and return to Nidhugg if it wasn't the vessel it acknowledged. Forcibly holding on to it would only result in the vessel bursting. It seems possible. The power of the King of Snowfolk, Monarch of Nightmares, was not mere cold. As Circa, reborn as the World Tree's nightmare, wielded the great power of winter capable of freezing even the sea of the afterlife, she could certainly freeze even the primordial darkness. But doing so wouldn't change anything. Eating it frozen is a bit risky. Me? Eating? No, I've given up. Suho dismissed Circa's concern. He had thought of another idea. Looking back and forth between Nidhugg and the Monarch of Trials, Amut. Amut, what do you think? Nidhugg and the Tower of Trials, aren't they somewhat similar? Amut paused at those words, then nodded, his eyes gleaming. Indeed, that makes sense. And he spoke to Circa, who wore a bewildered expression. Circa, first, freeze that primordial darkness. Prevent it from returning to Nidhugg. As Suho's and Amut's gazes focused on her, Circa quickly gathered her power. If that darkness was reabsorbed by Nidhugg, they would have to repeat the intense battle all over again. Crackle! Thus, all the cold focused on the masterless primordial darkness. Amut, seeing it frozen, grinned widely. Now it's my turn. Yes, we'll need a freezer. Fwah! Nodding at Suho's words, Amut stretched out his hand, and immense pressure forcibly compressed and condensed the frozen darkness, to the point where it could fit in one hand. Its state was extremely precarious. The primordial darkness writhed, trying to break the ice and return to Nidhugg as soon as possible, but Amut guided it with his authority, sealing it within the Tower of Trials. Fwah! Then a surprising thing happened. As Suho had said, Nidhugg and the Tower of Trials, both of which tested individuals to select the qualified, shared the same fundamental purpose. The frozen solid primordial darkness no longer resisted and obediently settled within the Tower of Trials, patiently waiting for a qualified individual, just as it had within Nidhugg. And eventually, that darkness found a qualified individual inside. none other than Thomas Andre, a human who overcame the trial he set for himself and finally seized the power of the King of Giants. However, that process was by no means easy. It would have been absolutely impossible for Thomas Andre alone. The Tower of Trials and the Monarch of Trials, Amut, had guided him onto the path of succession to inherit the primordial darkness, just like the priest Sung Suho had helped the others. Additionally, it wasn't Amut's work alone either. Slaying Nidhogg together, freezing the darkness, imprisoning it in the Tower of Trials. The role of the priest, previously carried out solely by Suho, was this time accomplished through the combined efforts of everyone else, the result being Thomas Andre. As for other monarchs having performed the role of the priest, well, if it weren't for Suho, we would never have inherited the power. They knew now. Back then, they knew nothing. They remembered their former selves. Back then, I didn't know how weak I was. That's why they could dare say such things, that they would be the next monarch, that they were the monarch's successor. But to argue about such qualifications, how weak and insignificant they were back then, how insufficient and pathetic their vessels were from Nidhogg's perspective. That must be why Nidhogg had tried to devour and kill them at first sight. But now I know what true strength is. Becoming stronger is akin to realizing how weak one truly is. Now, having received power thanks to Suho and truly becoming strong, Circa couldn't kill Nidhogg, but she could hold it captive like this confidently with her own strength. Upon the frozen sea of the afterlife, Nidhogg was trapped in the ice, unable to move, just like Circa herself had been during her succession ceremony. But then, Circa's gaze, concentrated on Nidhogg, trembled, and she urgently called out to Amut, "Lord Amut, something is strange. What is it?" Inside Nidhogg, something is moving. What? The primordial darkness? No, that's not it. A strange light appeared in Amut's eyes as he watched Nidhogg trapped in the ice. It's not the darkness, it's the one receiving it. Yes, but the one inside is. It's one of the two. Amut continued to watch the changes occurring inside Nidhogg with interest. At this very moment, only two beings were undergoing the succession ceremony inside Nidhogg, Gray and Sung Suho, and usually, when such strange things happened, generally, the cause is always one person. A smile touched Amut's lips as he muttered, "A curious event. Has the succession ceremony already ended? Then he should just come out." Why would he move towards where another darkness is located? Only 3 heads remained on Nidhogg, but those 3 were ultimately connected to Nidhogg's single body. Yet Sung Suho, who had been forced inside due to the class change quest, was, for some reason, moving within it, towards another head where a different darkness resided.